My name is Carla Whitmore. I'm 38 years old. I work nights as a janitor at Jensen Combat Arts, a martial arts academy that teaches discipline, respect, and the illusion of honor. For 3 months, I've scrubbed blood off mats and sweat off mirrors. I don't speak unless spoken to. Most of the students don't even know my name. They just call me Miss C. What they also don't know is that the man standing in the center of that mat, the one with the black belt, the commanding voice, the reputation carved in stone, is my half-brother Victor Jensen. And last Friday, in front of a full evening class, he looked right at me and said loud enough for every belt color to hear, "Our janitor wants to fight," he laughed. Not the kind of laugh that invites you in, the kind that locks you out. Then cocky as ever, he added, "Hey janitor, wanna spar?" For fun, the room exploded. Laughter bounced off the walls like punches in a cage. Even the white belts giggled. I was standing in the corner with my mop dipping it into the bucket. I paused. I didn't say anything at first. Then I raised my head. I looked at him. I looked at the mat I'd cleaned 100 times. I looked at the faces sneering at me as if I'd walked into the wrong world. And I said, "If I win, you tell them the truth." The laughter stopped, but not because they understood. They didn't know I was once a Marine. They didn't know I was once a national-level hand-to-hand combat instructor. They didn't know I had stood in war zones while Victor stood in press rooms. And most of all, they didn't know I was his sister. Victor's grin widened, thinking I was joking. He played it off like a stunt, like he was doing me a favor by letting me embarrass myself in front of 20 sweaty, overconfident students. He gestured dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen, gather around. This will be enlightening." And they came, the purple belts, the browns, the girl with her camera half raised, the guy who thought he was next in line to be head instructor. They circled us like spectators at a circus. No one noticed how I placed the mop against the wall. No one noticed how I slid off my gloves and quietly adjusted the weight on my heels. This wasn't about fighting. This wasn't about belts or rank or titles. This was about finishing something that was never allowed to begin. Victor hadn't recognized me, not truly. Not when I walked through the doors. Not when I swept his floors. Not even now, standing 10 feet in front of him. But in the next 6 minutes, he would remember everything. So would they. They jeered. I said nothing, but what happened next left everyone speechless. Their faces went pale. His smile disappeared. And finally I stepped onto the mat. Not as a janitor, not as his sister, not even as a former Marine. I stepped on as a woman who had been forgotten, betrayed, and underestimated, and who had come back not for revenge, but for truth. Because you can lie to the world, you can lie to a room full of students, but when you're face to face on the mat, the truth fights for itself. 14 years in the Marines changes everything: your posture, your tone, the way your eyes scan a room. When I came back to the city, I was a different person. Not better, not worse, just quieter. I didn't go home because there was no home left to go back to. The house we grew up in was gone, sold, stripped down, replaced with a parking structure and a cold plaque that said Jensen Center for Combat Excellence. That name, Jensen. It used to be our father's name. Now it belonged to my half-brother Victor Jensen and his martial arts empire. So I walked into his building wearing a gray hoodie and a pair of boots that had been to more countries than most passports. I didn't tell them who I was. I didn't ask for recognition. I asked for a job. Night janitor? No eye contact. No questions. Just cleaning supplies, a keycard, and silence. They gave it to me without a second glance. And for 3 months, that was my life. I arrived after hours when the students left and the lights dimmed to save electricity. I swept under punching bags, cleaned scuff marks off the walls, and disinfected mats stained with the day's sweat. I didn't speak unless spoken to. At first, no one spoke. Then came the nods, then the occasional "Thanks, Miss C," but never my full name, never Carla. I didn't mind. I preferred the anonymity. It let me watch without being watched. From the locker rooms, I'd hear Victor's voice over the intercom, booming, confident, full of the same charisma he had as a kid. Back then, he could talk his way out of anything. Now he talked like he owned everything. He taught technique well, I won't lie. His instruction was sharp. His control was precise. The students respected him. But the one thing Victor never learned, not from our father, not from any master, was how to respect people beneath him. He spoke to lower belts like they were replaceable. He demanded obedience from anyone he could intimidate. And worst of all, he smiled when he corrected people in front of a crowd. That's how I knew nothing had changed. The same boy who once told me I wasn't real family because my mom wasn't his mom. The same boy who refused to let me join him in karate class because girls don't belong there, was now a grown man with a dojo, a microphone, and a selective memory. I never told him who I was. Not when I mopped the corners of the training floor where he gave speeches. Not when I saw the plaque with our father's name etched underneath his. Not even when I stood 15 feet away organizing gear and he looked right through me like I was part of the wall. He didn't recognize me. Or maybe he chose not to. That's the thing about people like Victor. They remember who benefits them and forget who doesn't. But I remembered everything. The birthday he missed because he was too busy with a tournament. The phone call he never returned when I was shipping out. The voicemail he left after selling our father's house. I thought you died over there, Carla. Don't act like I did something wrong. No, Victor. You didn't do something wrong. You did everything wrong. So I kept mopping, kept listening. There was a spot near the heavy bag, a faded patch where blood had dried years ago and never fully came out. I scrubbed it every night. It became a ritual, as if I could clean away everything he built over the ruins of what we once were. And every time I passed by that spot, I whispered the same thing to myself like a prayer or a reminder. He teaches how to fight. But he never learned how to stand still long enough to listen. In the Marines, we had a saying, victory without honor is just ego with better PR. Victor had victory, he had no honor. And the night he challenged me in front of all those students that night wasn't just about a fight. It was about showing him that the janitor he mocked was the soldier he'd forgotten, and the sister he'd erased. Victor Jensen was the kind of man magazines loved. He had the look, tall, angular, confident, and the sound bites to match. They called him the man who built everything from nothing. In interviews, he spoke about grit and discipline, about growing up in a broken home, about pushing through pain to build the most elite martial arts academy in the state. And in a way, he wasn't lying. He did grow up in a fractured home. He did work hard. But what the glossy profiles never mentioned was that he didn't build it from nothing. He built it from something that used to be mine. After our father died, we inherited the house. It wasn't much a one-story structure on a modest corner lot, with a crumbling fence and a magnolia tree that only bloomed every other spring. But it was ours. The deed had both our names on it. I was overseas at the time on my third deployment. Communications were sparse. I wasn't thinking about property. I was thinking about survival. Victor emailed once asking what I wanted to do with the house. I replied, keep it for now. Let's talk when I'm stateside. I never heard back. Months later, I got a voicemail short-clipped and devoid of anything resembling remorse. I sold the house. Thought you died over there. Didn't think you'd care. That was it. No apology, no follow-up, no money wired, no papers sent. And just like that, half of what was left of my family and everything that tied me to this city disappeared. I could have sued him. Technically, I had every right. But there's something the battlefield teaches you that courtrooms never will. Some fights aren't worth winning if the process costs you your peace. So I chose something else. Not revenge, not confrontation, observation. I came back to the city under a different last name. I took a night shift cleaning job at his dojo. And I watched. I watched the studio that sat on the very ground our house once stood. I watched the plaques that credited Victor with vision, determination, and legacy. I watched the kids bowing to his photo like he was a modern-day sensei. But I also watched the cracks. The way he snapped at lower belts when they asked too many questions. The way he corrected female students twice as harshly as the men. The way he name-dropped war heroes he never knew to impress visiting parents. He wasn't cruel. He was calculated. And cold. He built an empire by deleting everything that didn't fit his narrative. I didn't fit. Not when we were kids and I beat him in our first backyard wrestling match. Not when I joined the military and he stayed behind. Not when I left for war and came back with scars instead of medals. Victor didn't like reminders of imperfection, and I was a walking, breathing reminder that his story was incomplete. I could have burst in one day, announced myself, demanded my share, my truth, my place. But I didn't. Because silence gives you power. It lets people speak freely. It shows you who they are when they think you're no one. And over those 3 months, Victor showed me exactly who he'd become. He was no longer my brother. He was a brand. But brands don't bleed. Brands don't listen. Brands don't remember whose sacrifice helped pave the way. I remembered. I remembered every birthday he missed. Every letter I sent that came back unopened. Every time my mother cried alone in that old kitchen while Victor trained for tournaments. He said he built it all from nothing. But I was the nothing he meant. And when he laughed that night and asked the janitor to spar for fun, he didn't realize he was asking the ghost of everything he'd erased to step into the ring. I'd seen her long before she ever noticed me. Kaylee Moreno, 20 years old. Fierce, fast, focused. She had a purple belt wrapped so tight around her waist it looked like it was holding back a storm. She was Victor's star student, the one he bragged about in interviews. She trained harder than everyone else, hit harder, talked less, but she watched, constantly. And one day she started watching me. At first I thought it was paranoia. Then I heard her whisper to another student near the lockers, "That janitor's always lurking. I bet she's from that rival studio across town." The kid laughed. She didn't, she meant it. To her I wasn't just invisible, I was suspicious. I didn't blame her. The best students learn to read patterns. And mine didn't match what they expected. I never looked tired after 8-hour shifts. I never wore earbuds or stared at a phone. I always stood with my back to the wall and my eyes scanning exits. It wasn't intentional, it was muscle memory. But muscle memory gets you noticed. One Thursday night, Kaylee was working on spinning back kicks near the weight rack. The floor was a little slick. I'd mopped that area 2 hours earlier and someone had spilled a sports drink afterward. Victor was in the far corner correcting a pair of beginners. I was restocking clean towels. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Kaylee plant her pivot foot, then slide. Her leg went out from under her, and her head was on a direct path toward the edge of a 40-pound steel plate. I didn't think. I moved. In 2 steps, I was behind her. My left arm hooked around her shoulder, my right braced her lower back. We stopped just inches from the metal. She gasped, breath catching in her throat. I steadied her, then gently stepped back. She turned around stunned. Her eyes scanned me not for recognition, but for assessment. Then she said it under her breath, "That's not janitor reflexes." And just like that, the watching changed. Before it was suspicion. After that night, it became curiosity. She didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. She just started paying attention differently. I noticed her shifting to the edges of class, more often choosing stations closer to where I cleaned. She started timing her water breaks around when I'd restock the coolers. Once I caught her staring at my boots for a little too long. They weren't standard janitor issue. They were reinforced combat grade worn at the soles. She was smart. She was connecting dots. A week later, she lingered after class, pretending to stretch. Victor had already left for a staff meeting. Kaylee walked over slowly, towel draped over her neck. She said, "You were military." It wasn't a question. I looked at her, then nodded once. No denial, no elaboration, just confirmation. She didn't ask which branch. She didn't ask what I did. She just said, "I figured." "The way you caught me, it was surgical." I shrugged. "Didn't want you cracking your skull open. You've got a future." She hesitated, then asked, "Why are you here?" Now that was a question, I replied carefully. Sometimes people come back to places they never finished with. She nodded as if she understood more than she should at her age. Then she said, "Victor doesn't like loose ends, especially when they make him look sideways." That was the moment I realized she wasn't just sharp, she was brave. And maybe, just maybe, she was going to be important when things came crashing down. I didn't need her to protect me, but I saw something in her that reminded me of myself before everything fell apart. She didn't trust easily, but once she did, she saw things to the bone. And whether she realized it or not, that night she fell and I caught her was the moment she stopped looking at me as the janitor and started wondering who the hell I really was. I noticed her before she ever noticed me, which is saying something because Sarah Lynn noticed everything. She was one of those people who always looked like her brain was 2 seconds ahead of the conversation. Mid-20s, sharp eyes, always carried a notebook. Even after class she'd scribble in it while others laughed in the locker room. Sarah was a brown belt, a solid one. She didn't hit the hardest, but her technique was crisp, efficient. She was also a part-time assistant instructor, the kind who actually cared if students understood why something worked, not just how. And during the day she worked in data science, a detail I overheard her mention once in passing, when helping a kid figure out timing drills. If you can predict behavior, you can prevent failure. That stuck with me. She wasn't like Kaylee. Kaylee was suspicion. Sarah was structure. She didn't talk to me, not at first. She offered the occasional smile, a polite nod. But she saw me. One rainy night I left my coat in the corner of the weight room, half covered by a folded mat. I was scrubbing down the benches near the showers when I heard the smallest clink. Sarah had picked up my coat, probably to move it off the floor. But as she did something, metal fell from the inner pocket. She crouched and picked it up. A small circular piece of brass, scratched and worn. It was my Marine Corps service coin. She held it in her palm for a long second, then glanced across the room. I didn't move, didn't say anything. She slipped it back into the coat, placed the coat neatly on the bench, and walked away. But her eyes weren't the same after that. The next day she stayed after class, alone, no notes, no students, just her and her phone. She sat in the corner back against the wall, typing something in and frowning. Later that week I saw her watching me again, not in judgment, not in suspicion, but in calculation. I knew that look. That was the look of someone who found a thread and couldn't stop pulling. That night I caught her lingering outside the storage closet where I kept cleaning supplies. She didn't speak right away. When I looked at her, she hesitated. Then she asked Whitmore, "That's your name, right?" I paused. Then gave a small nod. Her voice dropped to a hush. "You were in the Marines." Again, no denial. She exhaled. I looked. Couldn't find much. But there's a photo blurry of a ceremony in Iraq. A medal being pinned. Nameplate almost invisible, but there's a Whitmore stitched on the uniform. She tilted her head. "Is that you?" I didn't answer. She didn't press. Instead she said, "You were in a war. And now you mop sweat off mats while kids pretend to understand discipline." There was no bitterness in her voice. Only confusion. I said quietly, "Some people come home. Some people stay at war. And some come back but stay quiet." She nodded. Then she said something I didn't expect. "You had every right to show up with a story. Instead, you chose silence." I met her eyes, calm, steady. I didn't come back to be known. I came back to know something for myself. From that night forward, Sarah watched less like an analyst and more like a protector. Not openly, not dramatically. But when Victor barked at students too sharply, she took mental notes. When I walked into a room, she offered a silent nod, never forced. She never told anyone what she'd found. She just understood in a way few ever did, that some people fight with noise. And some fight by choosing not to speak. Until it matters most. The problem with staying invisible too long is that people start to forget you're there until one day you're suddenly everywhere. And Victor had begun to notice. I wasn't doing anything out of line. I kept to my schedule, cleaned, restocked, stayed out of the way, but Kaylee was watching me. Sarah was watching me. And lately, so was Victor. At first it was the glance over the shoulder kind of watching, the kind where you think someone's familiar but can't quite place them. Then it turned into the prolonged stare when I passed through the training floor during sessions, the slight pause in his speech, the half-second break in his rhythm. One evening, I walked into the storage closet to refill the disinfectant bottles. When I stepped out, he was waiting, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, posture, casual expression. Not. He didn't smile, didn't pretend. He said, "You've been spending a lot of time near my students." I held the bottles tighter, didn't respond. He took a step closer. "You know this is a dojo, not some place for people with mops to pretend they belong in the conversation." His voice wasn't loud. It was low, controlled, threat disguised as policy. I looked up. Finally, our eyes met. I didn't say a word. But whatever he saw in my stare, it made him pause. Just for a beat, but long enough. He straightened slightly, adjusting his tone. "Don't mistake kindness for tolerance. I gave you this job out of charity. Lie. I was hired by an assistant manager while Victor was out of town, but men like Victor rewrite truth when it suits them." He leaned in. "You've got a good gig here. Don't push it." I could feel his breath. Still I said nothing. Because silence isn't submission. Silence is space. And in that space, I let him sit with what he couldn't understand. Something shifted. He stepped back just half a foot. Barely noticeable. But to someone trained to observe combat stances, it was a withdrawal. I uncapped the bottle and started spraying down the bench behind him. Not because it needed it, but because I was done with the conversation. He stood there a second longer, as if waiting for a reaction. When he didn't get one, he turned and walked away. I didn't look back, but I knew that moment wasn't over. It was banked. A slow-burning fuse. Because men like Victor don't like being unreadable to others, especially not to someone they believe is beneath them. That night I stayed late. Not out of obligation, but out of instinct. I needed to reset the space, wipe the tension off the walls, along with the fingerprints. As I mopped the corner near the punching bags, I heard quiet footsteps. Sarah. She said he cornered you. I kept mopping. He made a point. Sarah folded her arms. So did you. I didn't reply. She stood beside me in silence for a minute, then asked, Do you think he suspects? I shook my head. Not who I am, just that I don't match the floor. She smiled at that, a small one. Quick. Then she said, He's threatened. Not because of what you say, but because of what you don't. She wasn't wrong. Men like Victor survive on narrative. I was a gap in his story, a shadow that refused to leave, a face he almost recognized, a presence that said, You don't get to control the whole room anymore. And while he hadn't put the pieces together yet, he was circling the puzzle. What he didn't know was that every time he tried to intimidate me, he was moving himself closer to checkmate, and I was just getting started. I didn't know Sarah had started digging, not in the malicious way, just curiosity turned into momentum. After finding my Marine Corps service coin, and after our brief conversation in the hallway, something shifted in her. She never asked another direct question. She simply did what people like her do best, connected dots. Late one night after class had cleared out, she sat cross-legged on the office floor with her laptop open, using the dojo's Wi-Fi. I passed by with a mop bucket and saw her screen flash between search engines and archived news clippings. A few clicks later, there it was, buried deep in an article from 12 years ago. A photo, grainy, faded, but recognizable. A woman in uniform, shoulders squared, eyes hollow, standing beside a stretcher as a helicopter prepared for liftoff. Below the image, the caption read, Staff Sergeant Carla W., honored for valor during Operation Iron Dagger. Credited with pulling 3 wounded soldiers to safety under direct fire. Sarah zoomed in. The nameplate on the uniform had worn edges, but it was there. Whitmore. She stared at it for a long time, then leaned back and whispered, Jesus Christ. The next afternoon, she pulled up the article again, this time during open mat training. Kaylee walked by and caught the photo over Sarah's shoulder. She squinted, leaned closer, and said, That's her, isn't it? Sarah didn't look up. Yeah. Kaylee sat beside her, didn't speak for a moment, then quietly asked, Why would someone like that be cleaning mats? Sarah's voice was steady. Sometimes silence is the loudest way to scream. That line rippled through Kaylee like a slap, and a sermon rolled into one. She closed the laptop. Not because the search was over, but because the answer no longer needed proof. That night, neither of them said anything to me. But they watched the way I moved. The way I avoided stepping on cracks in the mat that could cause someone to trip. The way I rolled towels, not just neatly, but uniformly edges aligned, like I was preparing gear for inspection. The way I walked around the room like every exit was a calculated distance. They noticed the scar on my left forearm, a thin white line running from wrist to elbow. Once I caught Sarah looking at it. I adjusted my sleeve without breaking stride. She looked away. Not out of guilt, but out of respect. These weren't kids anymore. They were women beginning to see the difference between strength and performance. And the more they saw, the more Victor's words began to hollow out. He still barked commands, still strutted across the mats like a general among troops. But something had shifted. Every time he mocked a beginner for messing up footwork, every time he dismissed a female student's question with a snide joke, Kaylee's jaw clenched just a little. Sarah's pen stopped moving. No one confronted him. Not yet. But the room wasn't echoing like it used to. The laughter came less often, the obedience less immediate. Truth doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it trickles in like water through cracked stone. You don't see it, but you feel what it leaves behind. I said nothing. I changed nothing. But they were changing, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone in the room. I wasn't supposed to hear the conversation, but like many things in my life, I heard it anyway because I was there silent and unseen, a shadow in my own story. It happened late on a Tuesday night. The dojo was dim empty, except for the clack of a mop bucket wheel and the low buzz of the vending machine. I was cleaning the windows in the back hallway when I heard footsteps, firm, quick, not student shoes. It was Victor. He wasn't alone. Sarah walked beside him, her usual calm, replaced by something tighter, like a string pulled taut. They didn't know I was there. I froze in the corner, cloth in hand, barely breathing. Victor's voice was low and clipped. Why are we talking about her again? Sarah kept hers steady. Because I think you need to know who she is. Not who she is now, who she was. He scoffed. You mean the janitor? She's just another charity hire. Quiet, odd. Keeps to herself. That's all. Sarah stepped in front of him. Her name is Carla Whitmore. Silence. Then Victor laughed dry, disbelieving. No. That's not possible. Carla. She died. Years ago. Her mother told me she disappeared overseas. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't disappear. She served. She earned medals for valor. And now she's here in your dojo. Another pause. I couldn't see his face, but I imagined it, the half grin, the shrug. Even if it was her, and it's not what kind of person comes back and takes a job scrubbing mats, that's not strength. That's pathetic. And that right there was Victor in a single sentence. If you didn't walk back into the room wearing armor and applause, you weren't worth remembering. But then something shifted in his voice. He asked quieter this time. Are you sure it's her? Sarah didn't answer right away. Then she said, you were sure she died. And yet you never once looked into it. That hit harder than I expected. Even for me. Victor mumbled something I couldn't catch. Maybe a curse. Maybe just his pride choking on the idea. Sarah pressed on. Why does she clean your dojo every night like a ghost haunting the floor where your story began? He didn't answer. She stepped closer. Maybe she came back because she knew this place was built on something stolen. His voice came back sharp. I didn't steal anything. The house was going to rot. She hadn't written in years. I thought. Sarah cut him off. You thought she was gone, so you erased her. That sentence echoed in the hall like a gunshot. I stood still, cloth in hand, breathing through my nose. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was ready. They walked away after that. No resolution, no agreement, just footsteps fading down the hallway. When I returned to the mats, Sarah glanced at me. She didn't speak, but her eyes asked the question. And I shook my head once, a small motion, but enough. Let him say it himself, or let the mat say it for him. Because people like Victor don't believe stories told in private. They believe in spectacles, in silence broken in front of an audience, in power measured by who hits harder or who stays standing. He wouldn't believe it was me until I moved the way he remembered, until I stood in front of him and took his pride apart with precision. The truth was out. It was hovering now in Sarah's mind, in Kaylee's curiosity, in Victor's denial. But it hadn't landed yet, not fully. And until it did, I would wait. One more day, one more night. Because the truth doesn't knock. It steps onto the mat and leaves footprints too real to ignore. The floor beneath my bare feet felt no different than it had the hundreds of nights I cleaned it. But now I wasn't here to clean. The mat belonged to no one tonight. And that was precisely why I stepped onto it. Victor was already there, grinning, relaxed, cocky. He wore his black belt like a medal, his name stitched across the hem in gold thread. I wore the same janitor uniform I always did. No belt, no patches, just sleeves rolled up and shoes off. The students lined the edges of the dojo, whispering. Most didn't even understand what was happening. To them, this was a fluke, a joke, a dare gone wrong. To me, this was the end of pretending. Victor gave a mock bow, then called out for everyone to hear. Let's keep it light. Just for fun? Yeah. His voice carried a laugh. But his eyes were searching, maybe for the girl he once knew. Maybe for something familiar in the way I stood. He didn't find it. The bell sounded a soft chime, someone hit on their phone. Victor lunged forward fast, throwing a sharp jab toward my shoulder. I didn't move at first, then just enough. The punch cut air. I tilted my head and whispered just loud enough for him to hear. You always tighten your shoulder before you jab. He blinked. I stepped to the left. He reset, feinted, then threw a right cross. Again I slipped out of range, letting the force pass within inches of my jaw. And you flare your elbow too much. It gives you away. He frowned now. The crowd chuckled nervously. Some thought this was choreographed. Others looked at each other in confusion. Victor pivoted and aimed a low kick. I stepped back just enough for it to miss. Still leave your left ribs open. You did that when we were 12. His legs snapped back. His fists tightened. Who the hell are you? He hissed. I didn't answer. He came in again, this time with a fury behind his hands, a flurry of hooks, body shots, and feints. Each one I read. Each one I moved. Minimal effort, no flash, just angles and breath. The students fell silent. You could hear their sneakers shift on the polished wood. He tried to clinch. I ducked under and pivoted behind him. You forget to guard your neck when you're angry. He turned, breath ragged now. Stop talking like you know me. I met his eyes. I do know you. More than anyone here ever will. He swung again, a wild, frustrated punch. I stepped in, this time not away. My hand rested gently on his chest as he froze mid-motion. I looked him in the eye. I gave you the house. I left you the keys. I wrote to you from Kandahar. You never wrote back. He staggered a half step, the punch falling limp. The room was frozen now. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Kaylee, arms folded, was staring with her jaw slightly open. Victor breathed heavily, chest rising and falling. He whispered, Carla. I said nothing, just gave a single nod. He stepped back like someone had struck him. No. You're supposed to be gone. I tilted my head. You believed what you wanted, because it was easier than owning what you did. He backed into the center of the mat, eyes wide. He looked around the students, staring, Sarah holding her phone mid-record. He looked small. This isn't how it was supposed to go. I walked to the edge of the mat, picked up the mop I had leaned against the wall. Then I turned to face the crowd. You've trained here, learned discipline, balance, control. You think that comes from punching harder? I looked at each face. I've seen real control. It's when you have power and choose not to use it. That's why I never raised a hand. Then I looked back at Victor, because the hardest fight I ever had wasn't in a war zone. It was in my own home. It was forgiving the man who erased me because he couldn't bear to share his story with mine. Victor's knees softened, but he didn't collapse. He stood there, all his belts and titles meaning nothing now. Because the crowd no longer saw a champion. They saw a man who had been dodged by every strike of truth. And they saw me, a janitor, a soldier, a sister, still standing. Unbeaten. Victor's arms were still up. But he wasn't fighting anymore. His fists trembled slightly, not from fatigue but from something deeper. Shame. Realization. The air in the dojo had grown thick. No more laughing. No more whispers. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz more quietly. I stood in front of him, unguarded, my hands at my sides. I didn't circle him. I didn't faint. I just breathed. Steady, even, present. Because the fight, if there ever was one, had already ended. Victor took one hesitant step forward, then paused. He looked at me like someone waking up from a long dream or falling into one. I met his gaze, calm, unshaken, unangry. He raised his right arm slowly halfway, then lowered it. His lips parted like he was going to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, I stepped forward. One slow, deliberate step. Then another. He didn't flinch. I was a foot from him now. I could smell the sweat on his neck, see the scar just under his collarbone, the one he got climbing our father's rusted fence when we were kids. I looked at that scar, then into his eyes, and I reached out, not with a fist, not with force, just a hand on his shoulder, a soft, steady pressure. Then gently, almost imperceptibly, I pushed. Not enough to hurt, not enough to strike, just enough. Victor's body gave way. He stumbled back a single step, then sat down. On the mat, legs folded, hands on his thighs, not fallen, not thrown, just lowered. The dojo stayed frozen, not a sound, not a breath out of place. I stepped back, not triumphantly, just with intention. Victor looked up at me from where he sat, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow. He looked like a man who had been saved from drowning, not by being pulled out, but by being shown the shore was always within reach. I turned slowly to the crowd. They didn't move. No one clapped. No one cheered. Not out of disrespect, but because no one knew how. This wasn't victory. It wasn't spectacle. It was something else. I looked down at the mat. Same mat I'd cleaned for weeks. Same scuff marks, same sweat stains, same blood specks I never asked about. And now, silence. I bent down, picked up the mop I'd left, leaned against the wall, then turned to face them all one last time. He didn't lose in martial arts, I said quietly. He lost because he forgot who he was. My voice didn't rise, but it carried, through every wall of the dojo, through every chest and every held breath. Sarah was near the back, hands covering her mouth. Kaylee stood with her arms now loose at her sides, no longer crossed. Even the younger kids had stopped fidgeting. They were watching not a fighter, not a janitor, not even a soldier, but a woman who chose not to strike and still struck something in them all. Victor lowered his head, not because I had beaten him, but because something inside him finally stopped resisting the truth. He brought one hand to the mat beside him. The other pressed softly to his heart. I didn't wait for an apology. I didn't need one. Forgiveness isn't something we wait to be given. It's something we choose quietly, bravely, when we're ready to let go of needing to be right. That night I didn't win. I didn't need to. I just reminded him of what he had forgotten. And that was enough. I didn't expect the clip to go viral. Maybe someone recorded it with their phone. Maybe someone streamed it live. It didn't matter. By morning, it had spread like a fire across social media. Janitor floors, master with a single touch. Is she a veteran or a phantom? The day the dojo fell silent. Some called me a fraud. Others called me a ghost. And Victor, he became the epicenter of it all. The comments were brutal. You let a janitor make you sit down like a child, fake black belt. Just a businessman and a GI. How can he teach respect when he didn't recognize his own sister? I didn't reply. I didn't post. But I watched. Because how people respond to truth says more about them than about the truth itself. At the dojo, the divide was immediate. Some of the older students, the loyal ones who'd been with Victor for years, refused to believe any of it. They said it was staged or edited. That push, he let her do it, one man insisted in the locker room. He was just being kind. She's not really a fighter. Others weren't so sure. Especially the younger ones, the observant ones. They'd seen the way Victor's stance broke down. The way my voice sliced through his rhythm like a scalpel. One girl whispered in awe. She didn't fight him. She revealed him. Parents started asking questions. One mother approached Sarah during registration. My son looked up to that man, she said, voice tight with anger. Now he's a fraud. Sarah didn't flinch. She just handed the woman a printed article, Marine Commendation Medal awarded to Carla W. 2009. The woman stared at the paper, then at me across the mat. She didn't say thank you, but she didn't tear it up either. In the days that followed, attendance dipped, then rose, then dipped again. The air inside the dojo became electric, not hostile, but charged with uncertainty. People didn't know what to believe, and in that gap where certainty once lived, doubt began to grow. I kept showing up, mopping floors, cleaning mirrors, washing towels, not because I had to, but because the act of serving in silence was something Victor had forgotten. And sometimes what you forget becomes the measure of who you've become. Then one evening a man walked into the dojo after hours. His gait was stiff, military, his hair was white at the sides, close cropped. He didn't take off his boots. He walked right up to the mat, looked me in the eye, and nodded. 3rd Marine Recon Fallujah, he said. I nodded back. He turned to the class, most of them frozen mid-stretch. She didn't shame him, the man said loud enough for all to hear. He shamed himself. He left without another word. Victor wasn't in class that night, but the next morning when I arrived early for opening duties, I saw him. He was standing alone in the lobby, staring up at the wall of framed photos. There he was, arms folded in front of the dojo's logo jaw, proud eyes forward. And there to the right, our father decades ago in a tournament stance. Victor's fingers hovered near the edge of the frame. Then slowly he lifted it from the wall. He didn't drop it, didn't smash it. He simply set it on the ground, then took down the next one, and the next, until the entire Victor wall was empty. I didn't interrupt, but I walked past him, mop in hand. As I passed, I said softly, "Walls don't build legacies, people do." He didn't look at me, but he nodded. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing he'd ever given me to acknowledgement. Kaylee started asking more questions about my unit, my record. I didn't answer most of them. She didn't need to know who I was to learn what I knew. Sarah, however, started leaving small articles near my locker. Old scans of military bulletins. A Polaroid of a woman, me holding a broken rifle in one hand and a wounded comrade in the other. There was a note, "We see you now, whether you want us to or not." The comments online began to shift. Less ridicule, more reverence, and more arguments. She humiliated him. No. She revealed the cracks that were already there. She should have stayed silent. She was silent. That was the problem. Victor stopped teaching for a week, then returned not with bravado but with quiet focus. He didn't wear his black belt, just a plain GI. He bowed lower than usual, listened more, spoke less. He never mentioned me, never named what had happened, but in small ways, posture, tone, humility, he began to change. Some students left, some stayed. New ones arrived, curious to learn from a place where truth had once walked quietly across the mats. And me, I kept mopping, kept wiping mirrors. But now when students passed, they nodded. Some smiled, some even bowed. Not because I asked for respect, but because I had stopped needing it. I never set out to teach again. Not after what I'd seen, not after what I'd survived. I thought I had left everything behind: the uniform, the medals, the stories. But sometimes life taps you on the shoulder when you're cleaning a mirror and says, "You're not done yet." It started with a question. Sarah approached me one evening after class, notebook in hand, eyes shining with something I hadn't seen in a long time, reverence without idolization. "Would you ever teach something else?" she asked. Not combat, not technique, but the stuff between the fights. I raised an eyebrow. "You mean life?" She nodded. She called it mental defense. I didn't say yes that night, but I didn't say no either. The next week, the dojo posted a flyer, "Mental Defense for Veterans," with C. Whitmore, an experimental course for those who fought battles others couldn't see. I thought maybe 2 or 3 people would show. The first night there were 9. Sarah sat front row, Kaylee beside her, arms crossed, pretending not to care but hanging on every word. And in the back, a man with 2 prosthetic fingers, a woman with a cane and a scar that reached from her eyebrow to her chin. I didn't teach technique, I taught stillness. I taught how to breathe when the world forgets you. How to walk through a grocery store when your nerves say you're still in the field. How to listen without trying to fix. How to name the shame without letting it speak for you. By week 3, I stopped bringing notes. I just spoke. They listened. Then they spoke. One night, Kaylee raised her hand. "You said the battlefield doesn't end when the war does." I nodded. "So how do you win a war that never ends?" I paused. Then I answered. "You stop trying to win. You try to understand." Word spread. People started referring to the back room of the dojo as Carla's circle. No mats, just folding chairs. A kettle for tea. Sarah brought a plant. Someone else brought soft lighting. One night I caught Victor watching through the window. He didn't come in, not at first. But the next day he approached me in the supply room. "I opened a space," he said. "A smaller dojo, near the West End." I raised an eyebrow. "Another franchise." He shook his head. "No branding, no fees." He hesitated as if swallowing something bitter. Then he said, "It's for women. Women who've been through hell. Who need to learn how to feel strong again." I studied him. The same man who once looked through me was now looking at me. "Why now?" I asked. He didn't flinch. "I don't want redemption," he said. "I want to become useful again." It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. The following month I visited the West End dojo. It was small, 1 room, no mirrors, no trophies. Just soft pads, neutral tones, and sunlight spilling through the high windows. There were no shrines to Victor's glory, just a single quote painted on the wall. "Power is not in the fist. It's in the choice not to clench it." That one I knew was his. When I entered, one of the women stood up nervously. "Are you here to teach?" she asked. I shook my head. "I'm here to witness." She smiled. It was enough. At my own class, numbers continued to grow, but I capped it at 12. I didn't want rows. I wanted circles. Kaylee became a regular. Then a helper. She'd open the doors early, bring pastries, crack dry jokes that made the room feel human. One night she lingered after everyone left. "You know," she said, "when I first met you, I thought you were weak." I laughed. "You weren't wrong. I was. Just not in the way you thought." She nodded, then asked, "Do you miss the battlefield?" I thought about it. The adrenaline, the chaos, the clarity of knowing exactly who you were and why. Sometimes, I admitted, but not as much as I miss silence that doesn't feel like punishment. She didn't ask more. She just left a folded napkin on my desk with 3 words scribbled on it. "You gave that back." Victor came to my class once, sat in the back, didn't speak. When it ended, he walked up and handed me a book. It was our father's old training manual. Inside a note he taught us to hit. "You taught me to hold. No signature, just a date." I placed it on the shelf behind me, not as proof, but as presence. We don't need to be recognized to be real. We don't need titles to be useful. We just need to show up fully, quietly, and without demand. That's legacy. Not what people remember you for, but what they become because of you. And if a janitor, a soldier, and a forgotten sister can become that, then maybe anyone can. The mats were quiet now. No grunts, no thuds, no shouting instructors. Just the hush of a Tuesday night and the soft hum of the overhead lights. I stood in the center of the dojo, mop in hand bucket nearby. It had become a ritual. Even now, especially now, I cleaned the floor. Not because no one else would, but because something about it grounded me. It reminded me I was never above the work. A few students passed by the glass wall and nodded respectfully. Not with pity, not with disbelief, just simple acknowledgement. No one asked why I was still doing this. No one looked twice. I liked that, because it meant they finally understood the hands that hold a mop can also hold a life together. I finished the last line across the mat, rinsed the mop, and wrung it dry. As I reached for the towel to wipe the corners, something shimmered near the bench. My Marine Corps badge. It had fallen out of my locker days ago. I thought it was gone for good. Someone had found it. Someone had placed it here, not in a frame, not on a pedestal. Just here quietly, waiting. I picked it up and felt the metal's familiar chill. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like memory. I remembered the desert, the night skies without sound, the heat that made your skin forget it was human. And I remembered the day I made the call, the one that saved 3 men and nearly cost me my spine. They gave me the badge, but they didn't know I was already bleeding on the inside. Still, I wore it, until one day I didn't, because I wasn't trying to be remembered anymore. I just wanted peace. Victor hadn't returned to my class, but that was okay. Redemption isn't always about circling back. Sometimes it's just stepping aside to let someone else move forward. Last I heard, his free dojo had grown, a waiting list, donations. Women who once hid behind sunglasses now holding their heads high. Someone asked me once if I'd ever forgive him. I smiled. I already did. Not out loud, not in a letter, but in the space I left for him to figure it out on his own. Back at the center of the dojo, I sat down, cross-legged, still, hands resting on my knees. The badge sat beside the bucket. I didn't tuck it away this time. I let it breathe. I looked at the floor, so clean now you could see the lights reflect. And I whispered to no one I didn't win that night because I was better. I won because I didn't strike. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't ache. It hummed. Like a song only the floor remembers. Fade out on a pair of calloused hands, one resting on a folded badge, the other gently squeezing a damp towel. Not to wipe anything away, but to remind myself I am still here, and I am whole. Before we say goodbye, I want to leave you with something. Not a lesson, not a moral, just a moment to breathe, a moment to remember, a moment to ask yourself, what kind of strength do you carry even when no one sees it? Because if you've watched this far, I know something about you already. You believe that quiet stories still matter. You believe that kindness is power. and you believe maybe deep down that healing is possible. So before we part ways, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if Carla's story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you love, or someone you used to be, please consider subscribing to this channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in second chances. A place where honor isn't worn, it's lived. Where wounds don't disqualify you, they deepen your strength. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.